This is, if you haven't been to the People's Forum before, you see what a wonderful facility this is to have right in the heart of Midtown Manhattan, with the politics that they have here, and it's a wonderful space that many, many organizations are able to use, and they were really gracious in letting UNAC have our conference here and worked really hard to make it happen. We have a lot of people registered. There's going to be a bunch more people here tomorrow, and we're going to fill up these seats tomorrow. And upstairs, there's going to be an overflow area where there'll be these big screens, and you'll be able to see and hear what's happening on the stage here. And we'll work out a way in which after each of the panels and the plenaries, which will be taking place here, the workshops will happen in other places, in other rooms. We'll work out a way in which after the panels, people can ask questions. So we want participation from the audience, questions and discussion. We'll give you some rules just so we can keep it flowing and make sure that people who want to speak can speak. I really want to thank the staff from People's Forum, especially the three people who worked a lot with us, which is Rita, Juan, and David. They are three people that have done a remarkable job in keeping this together. Now, if you haven't had a chance to check in at the desk and or register, make sure you do that as soon as you can. And you should have a brochure, which is the program that we're going to be following, with some minor changes. And one of those minor changes is on today's panel. We were supposed to have Ann Wright as one of the speakers, and unfortunately Ann has a serious family emergency which brought her down to Texas, and she's not going to be here. And so I talked to her on the phone earlier today, and she said she would really like to, I said, Ann, don't worry about anything, you know, really like to do just a video that we could show so she can welcome people and say a few words about the projects that she's involved on, which are two important projects. And she said she would do that. So if we receive that at some point, probably tomorrow, we will try to show that. But we do have some really great people, and I'll introduce them individually as they come up, who will be speaking tonight. And I will be doing a little talk also at the end of the people who will be speaking. So we're going to start tonight with a brief panel and some discussion, and after that we're going to have some really good music and just socialize for a while. One of the important things about the conference is that we meet each other, we talk, we learn from each other, we make new friends, we make new comrades, we make new connections, and we build the anti-war movement. That's the whole reason that we are here. So this panel is called, I believe it's the Fight Against Imperialism, Opposing Imperialist Wars. And our first speaker is Bahman Azad. Bahman is an Iranian-American peace activist. Bahman. Sorry, I get it wrong all the time, and he's a close friend of mine. Peace activist who has been involved in struggles for peace and justice since 1970s. He is the executive secretary of the U.S. Peace Council, a representative of the World Peace Council at the United Nations, and a member of the administrative committee of UNAC, the United National AntiWar Coalition. He is a co-chair of the Venezuelan Embassy Protectors that helped organize the fight for those folks that bravely held the embassy for 31 days against the right-wing coup leaders who wanted to take it over. He is the coordinator of the Coalition Against U.S. Foreign Military Bases. He's a co-coordinator of the Hands Off Syria Coalition and the People's Mobilization, chair of the Iranian Working Group of Veterans for Peace. Don't ask him what he does in his free time. So I'll let Bahman take the microphone now. think it's just on. By the way, we're being live streamed through the UNAC page, so if you have friends that you would like to let know about that, do that so they can all see here too.
Thank you, Joe. Greetings, comrades and friends. I am honored to speak tonight in my dual capacity as the Executive Secretary of the U.S. Peace Council and member of the Administrative Committee of UNAC. In both capacities, I greet and salute all of you and wish you this great conference a tremendous success. U.S. Peace Council and UNAC, as two of the leading anti-imperialist contingents of the peace movement, U.S. peace movement, have a long history of close cooperation with each other. Together, we have organized very significant events in the past few years. As all of you are well aware, the U.S. peace movement has a long history of struggle against imperialism's interventions in the internal affairs of other countries. But this history has had frequent ebbs and flows in different periods depending on the political situation of the time. The massive demonstrations that appeared before George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq, during which close to 500,000 anti-war people marched in Washington, D.C., dissipated after the start of the war and later went into hibernation with the election of Barack Obama.
Ajamu, the next election.
You shouldn't have done that, Ajamu. In 2008. We are so much closely working together that Ajamu is a common word for me every time.
Prediction for the future.
Although the warmongering policies of U.S. imperialism continued and even intensified during Obama administration, the U.S. peace movement remained relatively quiet in the fear of not attacking the first black president of the country. This also caused a deepening fragmentation within the peace movement with regard to how to respond to Obama's intensified militaristic policies. While the left and anti-imperialist forces continued their active opposition to Obama's administration's interventionist policies, the more liberal forces limited themselves to signing petitions and appealing to various government authorities for policy changes. The election of Donald Trump as president, however, created a potential for reviving the peace movement once again. It removed all the masks and pretensions by openly threatening several countries with regime change and imposing or intensifying illegal US sanctions against the targeted countries, especially Syria, Iran, and Venezuela. Trump's blatant imperialist threats also brought to the fore the conflict between the anti-imperialists and the liberal center forces within the peace movement. The liberal center forces, under the influence of persistent media demonization of the leaders of nations like Iran, Syria, Venezuela, and even Russia, refused to take side against US imperialism interventions with the phony excuse that so-called both sides are bad. This was a great opportunity for the US Peace Council and the leading organizations in UNAC to bring the left and anti-imperialist peace forces together and initiate the formation of a united front that would be able to force the whole peace movement to take side against imperialist interventions. Considering the US foreign military bases as the main instrument and the launching pad of all US imperialism's military aggressions around the world, together we drafted a unity statement and presented to our anti-imperialist allies in the peace movement for the creation of the broadest anti-imperialist coalition in the United States after several decades, namely the coalition against US foreign military bases. The new coalition brought together for the first time a broad range of forces, including some significant segments of liberal center forces that had refused to take side against imperialism in the past. This coalition was further expanded into global campaign against US NATO military bases. The result of these efforts was the convening of two tremendously successful and popular anti-bases conferences First in Baltimore, Maryland in January 2018, and second, an international one in Dublin, Ireland in November 2018. Those conferences were clear indications that we were successfully moving toward the creation of a unified anti-imperialist peace movement in the United States and around the world, although a lot of work was still needed for us to reach that important goal. With the intensification of the attacks on Venezuela, the US Peace Council decided that it was time for us to repeat what we did in 2016 with regard to US intervention in Syria, i.e. sending a high-level peace and solidarity delegation consisting of the top leaders of the US peace and justice movement to Venezuela. So we invited the leading members of our allied organization in the Anti-Bases Coalition, which included many leading organizations of UNAC, and every one of them agreed to join the delegation. And thanks to the selfless and dedicated support from our sister organization in Venezuela, COSI, the US Peace Council delegations was rapidly organized and was able to travel to Venezuela as quickly as March 2019. We had the honor of meeting with the many officials of Venezuelan government, civil society leaders, community leaders, leadership of the COSI, the leadership of the Communist Party of Venezuela, and finally the President Maduro. This trip was provided us with much needed concrete information to allow us to defend the Bolivarian Revolution of Venezuela and its legitimate democratically elected government and president much more effectively. The heroic effort to protect the Venezuelan embassy was in fact initiated by two of our delegation members, Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers, who are sitting here, along with a few other allies. With this act, they took our anti-imperialist struggle in the United States to a higher level. Not only did they engage the movement in a direct defense of Venezuelan sovereignty, but exposed the US imperialism's blatant violations of international law and the Vienna Convention. The whole movement was galvanized around this heroic act. All of our delegate members got involved in various forms from outside the embassy building, and significant part of the movement joined this to support the embassy protectors. With the US Secret Service raid of the embassy and the arrest of our 4 remaining protectors, our struggle has entered into a new stage. Our comrades have been charged with the false charge of interfering with protective functions of the state by the Secret Service and the government, which can carry maximum penalty of 1 year imprisonment plus $100,000 in fines. Although their first round of trials 10 days ago ended in hung jury due to the weakness of the Trump administration's case against them, we are still concerned that the government might push for a retrial. So we are now faced with a long-term legal and political battle, not only in defense of our falsely charged comrades, but also with no less important struggle to expose US imperialism crimes against the people of Venezuela and the whole humanity. For us, this is a very important struggle that hits at the core of US imperialism's illegal interventions. We are determined to carry this struggle to its final victory. We will be standing with the people of Venezuela and their Bolivarian revolution to the end until we achieve victory, regardless of what it takes. But in spite of all of our collective achievements, our peace movement is still too confused, fragmented, and weak to be able to put an end to US imperialism aggression around the world. The main reason for this confusion, fragmentation, and weakness is its lack of general understanding of the nature of imperialism itself. Unless the concept of imperialism assumes a central position in the peace movement analysis of our current situation, the confusion and weakness will linger on and will keep the peace movement from achieving its goals. What we need today is a unified, strong anti-imperialist front within the peace movement to steer the whole movement in an anti-imperialist direction. We have obviously come a long way in that direction. The broad anti-imperialist coalitions and campaigns that we have organized so far during the past decade testify to this fact. But moving forward and meeting the challenges that we are facing today requires that we further broaden, unify, and strengthen this anti-imperialist front by giving it a stronger coordinating core structure, one that can bring all U.S. anti-imperialist forces and organizations together in a single unified strategy against the imperialist system itself, not just on various impacts or effects of imperialism. It is my hope that this will soon be realized. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bahman. Our next speaker is Bernadette Ellorin. She is the national spokesperson of the U.S. chapter of, I'm going to get this wrong, Bagang Alan Sang Makabayan. Please do it for me correct when I get.
Yeah.
Go say it out.
Bagong Alyansang Makabayan.
Which is Bayan USA. It's the main center for anti-imperialist mass movements in the Philippines and the forefront of the struggle for national democracy with a socialist perspective. Ellorin also serves as the vice chairperson of the North America of the International League for People's Struggle, a global anti-imperialist and democratic formation of 300 member groups present in over 40 countries representing national and social liberation movements against imperialism and reaction. So here, Bernadette also was, up until recently, a member of the Administrative Committee of UNAC, but now the present president of Bayan takes her place in that position, and that's Rhonda Romero, who's sitting right up in front.
Thank you. I have a slideshow. Could my slides go up? Thank you. Sorry, I hate bios. Anyways. No, I just said I hate bios being read. It's fine. It's a formality. I'm just waiting for my slides. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to be coming from the perspective of Bayan, which has a chapter here in the US. And when we struggle against imperialism, in our context, we're really fighting for national liberation. That's what anti-imperialism is for us. And for many other neo-colonies around the world, they're fighting for their national liberation from the clutches of US monopoly capitalism, US militarism, US imperialism. Update on the slides?
Are we able to get the slides?
Yes. It's up. Yes. So, thank you. Surprise! The Philippine government wants to kick out the US troops from the Philippines. Do we support? Yes, that's a good call, but we have to also monitor the basis for why this call is being projected by the Duterte government at this particular moment in time. Next slide. This is President Duterte, who's all over the international news, and next to him is one of his closest allies in the Philippine Senate, that's Senator Ronald Bato de la Rosa, who is the former top-notch general of the Philippine National Police, which is funded by the US, as well as the main enforcer of the US-funded drug war in the Philippines, which has taken the lives of over 30,000 victims in the country. Next slide. So the call for the Duterte government to terminate the VFA, they actually issued a notice to the U.S. State Department calling for the termination of the Visiting Forces Agreement, which is a major military agreement between the U.S. and the Philippines, which allows for annual rotational port calls, exercises, war games, drone exercises, rest and recreation, refueling, sex industry work in the Philippines because of the U.S. military presence. So, but the Duterte government is calling for its termination because the U.S. Congress has canceled the visa of Bato, that senator, on the basis of his involvement in the drug war and also involvement in the incarceration of major critics of the U.S. Of the Duterte government in the Philippines. In particular, another senator, Leila de Lima, who's currently incarcerated because she's one of the most vocal critics of the U.S. of the Duterte government and the drug war in particular. So their basis is the U.S. visa. Our basis is U.S. imperialism. There's a difference between a U.S. visa and U.S. imperialism. So we have yet to see U.S. imperialism in the Philippines. This cartoon here is an illustration. It's racist war propaganda from the turn of the 20th century to really justify the U.S. military invasion of the Philippines back in 1899, at the tail end of the Philippine victory over Spanish colonization. The U.S. came in and launched its first major large-scale war of aggression for conquest, for invasion, for occupation overseas, which was the Philippines. And after that, the Philippines was the only U.S. direct colony in the Asia-Pacific region. But now it's a U.S. neo-colony. Next slide. So you can see how they really use racism to convince people that this war is justified. Because it was so racist, I want to point out, this is February's Black History Month, that many of the black soldiers in the U.S. Infantries that were stationed in the Philippines defected to the Philippine side because they found solidarity with the Filipino rebels. They recognized the racist character of this war, and because of that, they had more in common with the Filipinos than they did with the U.S. military. Next slide. So that's back in 1899. This is more recent photos of U.S. military presence because of the VFA and various other U.S. military agreements. The U.S. are in the Philippines because of under the auspices of counterterrorism. There are regular war games, regular drone exercises, regular rest and recreation stations in the Philippines with the U.S. Next slide. You can see these are just martial arts exercises with U.S. troops in the Philippines. Next slide. So this is a timeline of U.S. military agreements with the Philippines. So like I said, from 1899 to 1946, the Philippines was a direct U.S. colony, which was basically a colonial government. And it was really the U.S. colonial government that established the Philippine military, first as the Philippine Constabulary. And so the Armed Forces of the Philippines, as it exists today, is more loyal to U.S. imperialism than it is to the Philippine government. It's supported by U.S. imperialism. It's basically a proxy army, a surrogate army for U.S. imperialism in not only the Philippines, but in the region. So in 1947, after the U.S. granted independence to the Philippines in 1946, the U.S. was very clear to establish a framework agreement, the military bases agreement, which would ensure that the U.S. would have military bases all over the country. So between 1947 and the present, there have been about 20 or so U.S. military bases that we know of. Some were official and permanent, like Subic Naval and Clark Air Force Base. Some are unofficial and de facto, which is what we have now. We have unofficial U.S. military facilities that are being housed in Philippine military facilities. In 1951, another major agreement, the Mutual Defense Treaty between the U.S. and the Philippines, was established. Again, this is a Cold War era anti-communist agreement to basically stop the expansion of communism and the influence of communism in the region, particularly in the Philippines. And then in 1966, the bases agreement was extended for another 25 years. From 1998 to 1999, the Visiting Forces Agreement, or the VFA, the one that the actual agreement that the Duterte government wants to terminate right now, was introduced and ratified. And again, this after this agreement, like I said, allows for more port calls, more rotational presence in a way that is can be very insidious because you don't really know where they are all concentrated in the country. And then in 2000, the first Balikatan exercises were established. These are war games, regular war exercises between the US and the Philippine militaries under the auspices of countering or fighting off global terrorism. In 2001, after 9/11, the Philippines was named the second front to the US war on terror by the Bush administration. So since then, Balikatan has been annual exercises all over the country. Has killed many people all over the country as well. In 2002, the MLSA, or the Mutual Logistics and Support Agreement, was establishing that the Philippines and the US would equally support each other with their defense and logistics and cooperation. Of course, that's not really the case. These agreements are one-sided and onerous between a master and slave type of relationship. And then in 2014, we have the Enhanced Defense and Cooperation Agreement, or the EDCA, which is another de facto basis agreement that allows for these cooperative locations where more US troops can operate out of different types of facilities all over the country. So there are so many. The Philippines is one big US military playground. And you don't really know at any given time where the US troops are based because most of them are special operations forces. And then I will just add the counterinsurgency operations are another form of US military intervention all over the country. Wherever there are US bases, there are counterinsurgency operations. Next slide. This is a picture of Marawi City in the southern Philippines. It is a Muslim majority city. In the southern Philippines, we have a Muslim minority population that are fighting for their self-determination. They have their own self-defense units that are in negotiations with the Philippine government for autonomy. Next slide. So the Filipino people have been struggling against US imperialism and military presence in the country for a very long time, since the time of the Commonwealth era in the Philippines. Next slide. And it was really this struggle that's at the heart of the shutdown of the former permanent bases, Subic and Clark, back in 1991. Next slide. So I'm here to also say that we are living in the era of imperialism. That's bad news. But we're also living in an era of intensifying people's resistance all over the world, especially revolutions that are being waged for national and social liberation, like in the Philippines and all over the global south. Next slide. So I think it was mentioned earlier that we have to understand the character of imperialism as it exists. And in order to sharpen and expand our knowledge of imperialism, it's important to note that imperialism itself, that crisis is endemic to imperialism. And right now, imperialism is in an unprecedented scale of its own crisis, no? On one hand, there's been no real economic growth, even though the financial oligarchy says there is. There's really no economic growth all over the world. And on the other hand, this economic crisis spurns political crisis, which spurns fascism all over the world. On the other hand, people's resistance is intensifying and not allowing itself to be pacified by the ideological attacks of imperialism. So all of this makes for a very unstable character of imperialism right now, which is favorable for those of us in the anti-imperialist movement. Next slide. So all over the North, in North America and in Europe. Next slide. Next slide. In the global South, people are rising up, to take back the land. Workers are stepping out of the factories, calling for strikes. Students are walking out of their campuses, calling for resistance. Next slide. The indigenous communities all over the world are also rising up to take back their land from imperialist wars of plunder. Next slide. And in many areas, revolution is being waged in a very militant way through armed struggle, and that is a reality. Armed struggle is a reality of the crisis. It's a reality, and it is a legitimate form of resistance against imperialism. And so I just want to end with sharpening our anti-imperialist movement here in the US really does involve international solidarity with all forms of resistance all over the globe that are happening out of necessity, out of people's right to defend themselves and protect their ancestral domain. And so we want to see an anti-imperialist movement here in the US that's really in touch and in solidarity with these movements all over the world. Last slide. We should celebrate the resistance happening all over the world. In the Philippines, the New People's Army will be celebrating their 51st anniversary next month. Thank you. That's it.
Is that it?
Yes.
Oh,
Sorry.
thank you, Bernadette.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, when we were in Venezuela, as Bahman mentioned, one of the things about Venezuela is they have armed their people.
Mhm.
They are giving weapons to the people through the communities, and they are training them because they expect this country, the United States, to invade them, and they expect the people to resist them. When the United States says there is when the United States says that there is a dictatorship there, I've never known a dictatorship to arm its own people. And what we saw there was exactly the opposite of that. Our next speaker is a hero of mine. I didn't tell him that yet, but I just did. Camilo Mejia is an Iraq war veteran and a war resistor. I remember reading his stories, and it was so inspiring of what he did. He was born in 1975 in Managua, Nicaragua, but moved to the United States at an early age. After 5 months in active combat in Iraq, Camilo refused redeployment to his unit in Iraq, choosing instead to publicly decry the war as an immoral, criminal war of aggression. As a result of his public stance, he was court-martialed and jailed for desertion. Following 9 months of incarceration at Fort Sill military prison, Camilo was released and became a writer, speaker, and activist in the military resistance movement. His memoir, The Road from Ramadi, The Private Rebellion of Staff Sergeant Camilo Mejia. This is Camilo.
Thank you. I'd like to start by saying that we didn't write our speeches together, I swear, but there seem to be so many recurring themes, which I think it's a testament to the times that we're in. On November 1st, 2018, John Bolton gave a speech in Miami in which he first referred to the troika of tyranny to refer to Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, stating that the three countries are causing tremendous amount of human suffering. So today, as I sit here and speak to you, I would like to speak to you as a Nicaraguan, a Sandinista, and a proud citizen of the Troika. Because being a citizen of the Troika means that my country is a main target of US aggression, which means we must be doing something good. And just like the Axis of Evil speech back in 2002 when George W. Bush laid down what would become US foreign policy in the Middle East, this Troika of Tyranny speech also has basically laid down the foundations of US aggression towards Latin America. So I'd like to speak a little bit of the context that we're in, even though it may feel a little bit repetitive because of what my two colleagues here have spoken about. But in simple terms, I believe that the time of US hegemony has come to an end. And what we're also seeing, it's actually a lot more serious than that, because what we're also seeing is that the neoliberal economic world order also has proven itself to be ineffective and to be causing tremendous amount of suffering, human suffering, as opposed to the Troika. And so, what have these neoliberal policies caused? They have caused gross inequality, environmental destruction, great poverty, disease, infant and maternal mortality, the destruction of countries' infrastructure, the destruction of countries' sovereignty. And alongside that, what we have is a world of emerging world powers that are taking an approach that is very different and that is basically grounding its new relationships in collaboration, in the rebuilding of infrastructure, the development of new, cleaner technologies. And so what we're seeing really is that we're seeing that there's an alternative being created in the face of all this neoliberal suffering. And yet, what we see is that the United States, rather than change its ways and right its many wrongs, continues to make the same mistakes and to try to impose its neoliberal policies all over the American continent and the world. I don't have to convince you that many of the disastrous impacts that we are seeing in Latin America and the rest of the world, we are also seeing here. The neoliberal policies of privatization and austerity have caused the vast majority of people living in the United States great suffering, from gentrification to environmental injustice and destruction, to police and state brutality, to housing, healthcare, and education crisis. Neoliberalism, not the Troika, is causing all this tremendous human and environmental suffering. The situation, as my colleagues have said, my comrades have said, abroad isn't any less urgent. The massive uprisings that we're seeing from Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and San Pedro Sula to Paris, France, and throughout the rest of the world are in direct response to the impact of neoliberal policies and the impact that that's having on the vast majority of humanity. Neoliberal policies that translate to environmental destruction, morbid rates of mortality, hunger, disease, and war, only to name a few. So here we are this evening. And what more could we possibly ask for than to be able to participate in an anti-imperialist conference in the belly of the beast? In this time of transition of global scale, we are at the very epicenter of that transition, which means that we have to be very aware of the circumstances and historical context in which we find ourselves, which presents many dangers but also many opportunities. And in order to address those opportunities, I'd like to maybe just for a few minutes go back to the Troika. And I'll speak more specifically about Nicaragua. Between the years of 1926 and 1933, the United States used a big portion of its military power, including warships, artillery, and thousands of well-armed US Marines, to capture and kill the last remaining of the rebel generals in Nicaragua, Augusto Cesar Sandino. General Sandino gave birth to the popular and anti-imperialist struggle for sovereignty and independence from the United States when he refused to accept terms of a truce that would have resulted in handing control of the country and its resources to the United States. He continued to fight a guerrilla warfare in which he and his men were at a gross disadvantage. Yet thanks to the intimate knowledge of terrain, popular support, and the unbreakable resolve of his patriotic army, General Sandino prevailed in 1933, and since then, the Marines have never occupied Nicaraguan territory again. However, the United States did not give up. They simply resorted to the use of lies and betrayal to obtain what General Sandino had denied them for years in battle. They employed the services of a bourgeois liberal general named Anastasio Somoza to lure General Sandino into a trap, and he assassinated him exactly 86 years ago today. But the legacy of General Sandino inspired the struggle for liberation of a revolutionary movement that not only eventually defeated what became the Somoza dynasty, which ruled Nicaragua for more than 40 years, but which also became one of the three governments collectively known today as the Troika of tyranny. Of course, I'm talking about the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or FSLN, the colors of which I'm wearing around my neck tonight. And so, when the Sandinista National Liberation Front defeated the US-supported dictatorship of the Somoza family in '79, the United States did not wait long to launch a counteroffensive to retain control and began training and financing the mercenary army known as the Contras. But since US Congress had banned the funding of mercenary armies, the Reagan administration had to resort to creative ways to support the puppet army, including the sale of weapons to Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, a scandal that became known as the Iran-Contra affair. That was the same war in which the US armed the Iraqi army of Saddam Hussein with chemical weapons which were later used against Kurds and the Iranian military and civilian population. Another scheme to keep the war going saw the CIA facilitating the trafficking of crack cocaine into African American neighborhoods in LA, which became not only a health epidemic but also a social one, as it created a violent drug trafficking environment, causing alarming rates of addiction, mental health issues, unemployment, homelessness, to name a few, all while the Reagan administration cut funding to social programs, including mental health services, housing, education, and other basic needs. When the FSLN lost the general election in 1990, a series of neoliberal governments immediately began to undermine all of the achievements of the revolution, including the land reform, the literacy campaign, victories in gender equality, healthcare, education programs, workers' rights, and much more. The country ceased to be a sovereign state nation to become a cheap market for transnational companies to savagely exploit with no regard to the country's people or its natural environment. A situation similar to the drug epidemic of LA ensued in Nicaragua, as most of our citizens lost the safety net that had been provided by the Sandinista government. Mortality rates once again skyrocketed, campesinos lost their land, illiteracy went through the roof, poor children became malnourished, massive unemployment led to higher crime rates and unsafe neighborhoods. And with the sale of the electric company, the country went into a 16-year period of literal darkness. It's going to be more like 5. Despite the grim reality that befell Nicaragua for 16 years, the United States government or the US corporate media never reported, much less complained about, the morbid existence of most Nicaraguans during the 16-year neoliberal period. There were no human rights organizations writing reports about the alarming rates of mortality, hunger, disease, or anything else caused by privatization and austerity neoliberal policies. The Organization of American States never expressed any interest in the country, despite blatant electoral fraud overseen by the United States to prevent the Sandinistas from returning to power. It was as if the country did not exist anymore. So today's Sandinista government, in power for 12 years, has been able to cut poverty in half, extreme poverty by 2/3, provide universal health care and education to all our citizens, rebuild our infrastructure, become one of the safest nations in Latin America, achieve 90% of food sovereignty, increase access to electric power from 54% to 92%, launch credit and lending programs to support hundreds of thousands of micro, small, and medium-sized businesses that place the country in the top 3 nations in the world in terms of gender equality. Nicaragua is not alone in these achievements. Under Presidents Chavez and Maduro, despite constant US intervention in the form of sanctions, sabotage, and regime change operations, Venezuela has launched a series of programs designed to promote the development of the South American nation, including housing programs that have built approximately 3 million homes for Venezuela's poorest citizens, food distribution programs, education programs, and much more. In the case of Cuba, not only has the revolution survived over 60 years of economic, political, diplomatic, and even military war from the United States, they have managed to achieve incredible victories in healthcare and education, not to mention medicine, climate resilience, the development of a sustainable economy, and much more. Of the hundreds of millions of hungry children who roam the world homeless, not a single one of them lives in Cuba. As a revolutionary island, despite decades of US aggression, has managed to completely eradicate homelessness. This is the Troika. But I share all of this with you, not in the interest of my country or Venezuela or Cuba. I'm sharing this with you tonight because I keep hearing people say that the enemy of my enemy is not my friend, or denouncing US imperialism doesn't mean that we have to support dictatorships. Another common one is we must support grassroots movements standing up to totalitarian regimes, even if they once were progressive. So let me tell you something. The enemy of your enemy, namely the Troika nations, as well as other nations who are being targeted by US regime change policies and other forms of aggression, are not being targeted because they are dictatorships. They are being targeted because we represent an alternative to the prevailing neoliberal world order. Which is the same world order that's denying American youth of a bright future, that's destroying our environment, that's turned basic human necessities into products to be bought and sold in transnational markets. We need to build a united anti-imperialist, internationalist movement that is capable to understand the historical moment in which we find ourselves. A movement that is capable to tell the difference between an economic model that serves the interests of the poor and not the interests of the rich and transnational corporations. We need to understand how US-funded NGOs have seized control of the post-truth narrative of dictatorship and democracy, and how they have weaponized identity politics, human and civil rights to create division among us and to redirect our solidarity efforts towards the rejection of governments and revolutionary movements that are fighting tooth and nail against the very same policies that are causing tremendous human suffering and environmental degradation in our communities right here in the United States. US imperialism has many allies, very powerful allies, and they are not divided. They don't waste time vilifying each other as they launch media smear campaigns that pave the way for regime change in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and everywhere else, where they are burning black and brown bodies and destroying progressive programs for the poor under the guise of pro-democracy movements. The same people who flood US streets with drug and violence are supporting efforts to overthrow revolutionary governments. The same people that have facilitated the use of chemical weapons against Iraqi Kurds and Iranian military and civilian populations, and who are demolishing Palestinian homes, are funding mercenary armies in places like Colombia and Nicaragua, and they are behind the narratives that keep us debating the merits and flaws of revolutionary governments fighting for self-determination, while they stand united in the destruction of our environment, our future, and our ability to live a life with dignity and to fight for what is decent and right. So, to wrap up, I stand here tonight, or I sit here tonight rather, as a proud citizen of the Troika, a Nicaraguan, as someone who has been a Sandinista since before birth because both of my parents were insurgents in the fight against Somoza, and who will remain Sandinista until the very moment I draw my last breath. And I'm not here to apologize for it. I'm not here to apologize for my government as we build this movement. I am not here to request help for our struggle. I am here to tell everyone that your struggle and mine are one and the same. And that if we are to work together, as we should, we must build an anti-imperialist movement that is grounded in a strong understanding of regime change in the 21st century, and that is capable to go beyond the corporate headline, to dig deeper, to reach across smear campaigns and see through the smokescreen of imperialism, in order to see the values that unite our struggles and that can help us work together as we fight for a better world. Thank you.
Well, Camilo went a little bit over time, but it was worth it. I'm just going to say a couple of words, and then we're going to have some discussion and questions, your thoughts, because we want this to be a participatory conference. That's the way we build the movement. You know, the words that I just heard are codified in one of the slogans that UNAC uses, which is "End the wars at home and abroad," because we see the militarization in the black and brown communities at the borders, and we see the attacks on working people throughout this country as well. UNAC this year is 10 years old, and this is our 5th national conference, and we survived this time when other coalitions perhaps have not. It was a difficult time. When UNAC was formed at a conference up in Albany of 800 people, people were questioning why we needed an anti-war movement. Some people actually said, well, you know, Obama's elected, and he's going to end the wars. We thought not so. We thought it was very important while there were troops overseas, while the wars were continuing, that we have an anti-war movement. And we put together a coalition that today has about 160 member groups. If your group is not a member of UNAC, there is a form in here, and you can fill it out, and you can join or go onto the website and join there. We need a movement, an anti-war movement in this country today more than ever. And I've been involved in the anti-war movement forever. I started my anti-war activity as a college student against the Vietnam War. And I actually was a staff person in one of the 2 major coalitions of the time, the National Peace Action Coalition, that organized some of the huge, massive rallies where millions of people came out a number of times, marched in the streets, protested, used all sorts of tactics, but it was a gigantic mass movement. But you know, in the beginning of the Vietnam War, it wasn't a mass movement. In fact, in the very early polls in the Vietnam War, they were saying only 8% opposed the Vietnam War. They actually called it the only consensus war in U.S. history at the time. But 9 years later, 88% of the American people were against the war. So that shows you what we can do, and that's the task that is in front of us. And anti-war sentiment grew and became so deep in the society, especially in the culture, in the youth culture, in music, in the dress, and everything that was part of living your life at that particular time. And it got down right to the level of the soldiers. And the soldiers, towards the end of that war, refused to fight. It also happened in the context and helped push that context of other struggles that were developing. Black nationalist movement and black liberation movement, Chicano movement, and the Puerto Rican movement that was taking place, the women's movement, right for abortion, struggle for abortion rights, the gay rights movement that took place. And these movements were changing the consciousness, were part of the changed consciousness of the whole population, and it got right down to the soldiers. And the soldiers ceased to be a fighting force in Vietnam. They refused to fight. They were told, we're going to go take that hill by one of their officers, and they would say, well, you go take that hill. In the last year that the U.S. was in Vietnam, there were more than 800 cases of fragging, which was people deciding they're not going to follow those people, and if they're not going to kill the Vietnamese, they're going to get rid of their leaders. And they really couldn't fight. There was a black nationalist struggle that was going on in the military. No Vietnamese ever called me nigger. There was peace signs on the helmets of the soldiers, and the U.S. had to get out. And you know, in the early days when I was young, we were learning in school that the U.S. never lost a war. After Vietnam, they never said that anymore. You might remember the pictures of the helicopters leaving and the people that collaborated with the Americans trying to hold on to get out of there, and they put their tails between their legs and the U.S. Got out and lost that war, and the Vietnamese people won, but at a tremendous, tremendous cost. 4 million Vietnamese were killed. About 50,000 Americans were killed. But those costs don't even tell the whole story. As soldiers know who have to go through these stories, the PTSD and the suicides and the mental problems and alcoholism and so forth that affect them for all their life and affect all of society. We need to end all of those wars. But after the Vietnam War, they developed a word, a phrase that they said it was called the Vietnam Syndrome. It was not made up by the Vietnam anti-war movement. It was made up by the media and the politicians. The Vietnam Syndrome was what they thought was a bad thing. You see, people in the United States didn't want to go to war again like Vietnam. And so they were very cautious after Vietnam in terms of moving towards wars. And it took a whole generation, and then what happened at 9/11, whatever happened at 9/11, to turn the population back to a war footing and say, let's go to war. But it didn't last even that long. You know, they invaded and occupied Afghanistan and still are there. And from 2001 to today, almost 20 years, the longest war the U.S. has ever been in against one of the weakest countries. And the Taliban today controls more territory in Afghanistan than they did at the time of the U.S. invasion. And that's why the U.S. is negotiating with them, because they can't win that war even. Or the Iraq War, where they went in and invaded. But then they thought maybe that's not going to be a good thing. You remember February 15th, 2003, right before we went into Iraq, millions came out in city after city after city around the world. 1 million in London, 1 million in Tokyo, 1 million in Rome. We had 500,000 here in New York, another 250,000 in San Francisco. And we marched and we protested. And the New York Times had to say, well, there are still two superpowers in the world. One is the United States, and the other is the people that were out in the streets. But the U.S. didn't budge. I got that idea that it was a different time when the mass movement, than the mass movement during the Vietnam War, when Bush came out and saw all these people. Demonstrations for the first time in history took place in every continent in the world, including Antarctica, where there are two places where there were populations in Antarctica. One is right at the pole, and the other is at the some base on the shelf. The people that got out and protested, the scientists and so forth at the pole, around the South Pole, made a peace sign with their bodies in the snow and took a picture of it in the helicopter. So there was demonstrations in every continent. But Trump came out and said, Bush, same difference, came out and said, well, it's a good focus group. And they didn't move them. The demonstrations didn't move them. We never thought a demonstration could move anybody, even a mass demonstration. But a mass movement, and demonstrations are part of building a mass movement. And that's what we need to build today, is that kind of mass movement. But it didn't move them because it couldn't move them. The United States today has military in 172 countries around the world. In any given day, U.S. Special Forces are in operation in about 70 countries. The United States has about 20 times the number of foreign military bases as all other countries in the world combined. The military-industrial complex, along with the prison-industrial complex, are part of the entire economy of the United States. We'd collapse without it. You see all these politicians on these debates, these democratic debates that are taking place, making all these promises. Well, you know, with the discretionary tax dollar today, about 64 cents out of every discretionary tax dollar goes to the military. There's no way in the world they can do the programs that they're all saying with the other 36% of the tax dollars that are going on. It's such a part of the economy, the military-industrial complex right now, that our economy would collapse. Imagine, you know, we say that we have a low unemployment rate, which is not true. They changed the way they count unemployment figures, so it sounds low. It's just simply not true. But could you imagine if we demilitarized, if we told the soldiers, go home, get a job? If we took the 2.2 million people out of the jails, 25% of the world's population, jail population, is in the United States, and we only have 5% of the world's population, and took the 2 million people that keep them in jails and said, go out and get a good job, get an honest job. Could our economy support that? How could it do it? It couldn't do it. And so they're going to fight like crazy. And the fight against war is a fight to end that kind of system. Today, we can say something we didn't say during the Vietnam War, that it was difficult to say because there was so much red baiting. We have to end capitalism to end war. We have to do it to save the earth. We have no choice. And today, the anti-war movement coming together in a coalition of many, many groups and understanding that there's a war at home and a war abroad, and bringing all those forces together under one umbrella into a coalition, many battles, many struggles. We need to support them all. If we can do that, you know, 35 people 35 and younger in the United States, in their majority, despite all the red baiting that has happened in this country, believe socialism is a better solution than capitalism. It is our job, it's a hard job, it's our job to mobilize that sentiment, to mobilize those forces, to bring together a mass movement together that can change the system, bring us a world of peace and prosperity and no more war for all people. And that's what we do. And that's what we're trying to do, and that's what you're all doing here. And I thank you for being here. And if you're not part of UNAC, please be part of UNAC. We need you. Thank you.